with Dr. Tania Israel, who is, this webinar is being presented on behalf of Division 17 section on training and supervision. So hopefully you're in the right place, navigating political differences in supervision and training with Dr. Tania Israel, who is going to be giving us a brief presentation about her book titled Beyond Your Bubble. How to connect across the political divide, skills and strategies for conversations that work. And so she's going to be giving us a brief presentation. Then we have some questions for Dr. Israel to answer, and then also going to be pulling some questions from the chat. So as folks are coming in and as we're going through the webinar, if you do have questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. We are asking folks, because we have such a large number of people registered for the webinar, to please limit what you put in the chat to be questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And please keep your comments minimal just so that we can filter through those questions as they come in. And obviously, please, if you do make comments, please keep them friendly and welcoming. And I really want to thank Dr. Israel for coming and sharing her time with us today. Dr. Tania Israel is a professor of counseling psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's an educator, researcher, fellow of the American Psychological Association, and the past president of the Society for Counseling Psychology. And like I said, Dr. Israel's book, Beyond Your Bubble, How to Connect Across the Political Divide, Skills and Strategies for Conversations That Work, grew out of her skill building workshop that she developed and delivered to hundreds of people following the 2016 election. Obviously a very, very important topic. So we're excited to have her here today. And with that, I want to turn it over to you, Dr. Israel, to share your presentation with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carey. I have known you for so many years now. And we've gotten to work together. And so I'm just really happy to be here. I was sort of like, oh, maybe we can do a Zoom meeting so I can see everybody's faces and it'll be like a social hour or something, because apparently I'm really missing just that that great counseling psychology connection. So anyway, I'm delighted that all of you are taking some time today to be here. And I'm just going to do a really quick something so that you'll have some idea of what this work is that I'm doing. But then I really mostly want to have a conversation and get to answer questions and talk. And so I'll launch into this. But the work that I'm doing is about bridging the political divide. And so I'm just going to share a few tips that I often go to in terms of how to go about doing that. But then we can talk about how does that apply to supervision and training. And so this work for me most recently started after the 2016 election. It was really clear that people were having trouble connecting with other folks across the divide, and that was really limiting our understanding of people. And so because I'm a counseling psychologist, I'm always like, what can I do about it? And because I was teaching a class on social justice and counseling psychology that Dr. Carey was taking, we actually collaborated on something. And so the very first resource that came out of this was something that we worked on together, which is something I call the flow chart that will resolve all political conflict in our country. Because, I'm optimistic like that. So this was really a way for us to sort of put together what are the intentions that people have about dialogue and about how to navigate political conflict, and then what are the skills that they need to do that. So it really started out in this, and I'll share a link to this at the end. So you're welcome to download it from my website. You can order it on a Thanksgiving themed placemat if that's going to help people. So whatever, this is a resource that's available. Spoiler alert, the flowchart did not actually resolve all political conflict in our country yet. I really think that's just a distribution issue. So we just want to get this out to everybody. But at any rate, it was clear that more was needed, because I realized it's not enough to tell people this is what you can do. But as you all know from a training perspective, it's not enough to just say, you should listen, like people don't know how to do that. So the next phase of this work for me was that I developed a workshop, a 2-hour skills building workshop that was based a lot in what I've been teaching in terms of helping skills for the last 20 years. But then, some other pieces as well around perspective taking, managing emotions, things like that. And so several hundred people went through the workshop, including people who are in political organizations and nonprofits and just community members generally, and students, and all kinds of different people from different political perspectives. And from doing that, it really helped me to understand, like, what do people need? How do I explain these things to people? How do they build these skills, and what are the barriers? And so from that, and people kept saying, oh, we want more like resources. And I was like, well, all right, I guess now I got to write a book. So I ended up writing this book, Beyond Your Bubble, and it came out in the summer of 2020. And it turns out that it was an incredibly timely book, because apparently leading up to the 2020 election, there were some conflicts that people were experiencing around politics. Who knew? So it turns out that a lot of people wanted to talk to me about the book. So I've gotten to talk to lots of folks about listening. That's my new thing. I'm like, listen to me talk about listening. But it's great because it's been this particular political moment. It's really motivated people to want to develop some skills and to be interested in this. So whenever I talk with people about dialogue, I always ask them, like, what is it that interests them in it? What are their motivations for dialogue? And these are the most common things I hear from people. There's someone in my life with whom I want to maintain a good relationship. I want to persuade others to see things the way I do. I cannot fathom how people can think or act or vote as they do. I'm hoping we can find common ground, or I want to heal the political divide. These are the most common things I hear. So when I look at those motivations, I'm just going to tell you that the first tip that I always put out there is, no matter what your motivation, the best thing you can do is to promote understanding. Because to achieve any of these goals, you're going to need to understand the other person. If you want to maintain a relationship, you want to really focus on that connection. If you want to persuade other people, there's no way you're going to do that or to find common ground if you don't know where they're coming from. If you can't understand people, then you want to promote understanding. You want to understand them, and also healing the political divide is going to do that. So that's the first tip, is that promoting understanding is really key. The great thing about that for all of you is that we know how to do that as psychologists. Like that's our jam. So second tip is, when we are trying to promote that understanding and engage with others, we need to do that face to face, not Facebook to Facebook. There's actually evidence that when we are arguing with people on social media, not only is it not going to bring them around to our perspective, but we've got a better chance that we're going to push them farther away. So face to face, not Facebook to Facebook. The third tip, again, this is something that you all know as psychologists, but tip number 3, to listen. Like, how do you listen? You want to provide uninterrupted time for someone to speak, and then summarize what you heard. It's all about reflective listening. And that's a huge piece of what I've been teaching, because it turns out most people don't know how to do that. So that continues to be really key. And again, we're so good at that. So we've got the market on that. All right, the next thing is, when we're having a conversation with somebody, we want to think about, what do we want to do from each side of that conversation? So because people always say, well, when do I actually get to talk? I'm tired of listening. So when you're going to talk, the way you want to talk is you want to share your stories. Don't just share stats and slogans, not just something that can fit on a hat or a t-shirt or a bumper sticker, but instead talk about, how did you come to your views? What influenced you? What experiences have you had? What people have you encountered who have shaped your perspectives? And what meaning do things have for you? And so that also then, tells us something of what you should be doing on the other side, which is to be curious about and encourage people to elaborate about the meaning of things, about their values, about their experiences. So there was a thing that happened at the Capitol on January 6th, and that had so many different meanings for different people. And so, you want to find out, like, what did that mean to you? Like, and find out more about that, and not just about, like, did you think that was a good thing or a bad thing? There's so much more beyond that that we can learn. And then the final tip is to breathe. Breathing, again, we're doing it all the time, but we're not always breathing in such a way that it's going to help us to be in a place to have dialogue and to really understand people who have a different political perspective. You all know something probably about managing emotions, emotion regulation, and we might notice that not only when we're talking to somebody, but just even anticipating having that conversation, you're getting flushed, your heart's beating fast, you're breathing shallow, your muscles are tight. And and I put people through an exercise at my workshops where I have them imagine talking to somebody and they're experiencing all of that. So when we breathe, my book's called Beyond Your Bubble. I have a thing about bubbles. And so what I encourage people to do is breathe like you're blowing bubbles. Okay, so take a deep breath in and then breathe out slowly and steadily. And that's a way to help to regain your equilibrium so that you can be more present and so that you can accomplish any of those goals that motivate you to want to have dialogue. So those are my quick tips. I can tell you that there's a whole bunch of resources. You can look at my website. You can read my book. You can subscribe to my newsletter. You can download this flow chart that's gonna, change the world. And you can follow me on social media, all of that. But I want to put all this out there to you so that you've got all that available. I think that Celeste is putting some things in the chat also, some links. One more thing I'll tell you, one of the links that I asked her to share is to an article that I wrote recently on published on Medium, because one of the things that gets people so upset and why we need to breathe, and we can talk more about this if you've got more questions about it, but one of the things that's really affecting us is our perception of people who we consider to be on the other side. And it turns out we are probably wrong about who we think they are and what we think they're like. There are a lot of reasons psychologically that shape how we view other people and how we view ourselves within these contexts. And you might know from social psychology, we've got some flaws in our operating system. We're not always seeing things accurately and in an unbiased way. And so I try to help people understand, like, what are the things that are causing us to have these skewed views. And certainly media is part of that. But also just our own psychology is part of that. So take a look at that if you're interested in knowing more about it. And that's all I wanted to share. And I now want to just have a conversation with Dr. Carey and with all of you. So I am open to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the like drive-by version of some of what you've included in your book and all the tips and tricks. I love this idea of the Thanksgiving placemat that I can use as a reference point. I know that you've like the materials from your book have really gone out and are accessible to a whole array of folks, not just mental health providers, but everybody. It's a relevant topic for everyone. And so, important dialogues that we need to be having in our country, at our workplace, in our homes. And I guess to start us off with a question for you, I was really curious to know how folks have received your book, received your training, and what are some of the things that have surprised you about this process you're engaging in of training people to engage in these dialogues differently?
Oh, that's such a good question. So when I started doing the workshops, I was like, okay, I just need to help people to recognize what their motivations are. And once they have those motivations, then I just need to give them the skills. And once they realize they have the motivations and they have the skills, then everybody's just going to go out and do it, right? Well, it turns out that that's not right. That shockingly, that didn't quite work. Part of the reason I realized for that is people might want to connect and they might want to understand, but people have more than one want. And so at the same time, people might say, well, I want to find common ground, but I also just want to be able to express myself freely and not have to hold anything back, or not have to, shape how I share things, or not have to manage my emotions. And so people have multiple wants that sometimes conflict with each other. And so that makes it challenging. So one of the things that I've tried to do with that is help people to be more aware of what those different wants are that they have, and to think about how are you going to get those different needs or wants met. And it might not all be in one conversation with one person. So you might want to be able to vent and express yourself, and and get support, because people are always saying, but I, they're not listening to me. I want to be seen. And I'm like, well, you might not be able to do that with someone who doesn't already agree with you. That might not be the best way for you to get that need met. Like, maybe go to somebody who's already on your side, and you can get that in a different place, so that you can have a specific kind of conversation with somebody who doesn't already agree with you. So that's really one of the things that stood out to me. In terms of how it's been received, I think it's a little bit mixed, because a lot of people are very enthusiastic about it. Like, I'm hearing a lot of, just even the listening stuff. People are like, wow, listening, this is, transformational. And in fact, the funniest thing that happens is when especially leading up to the election, I was talking to all these journalists, and they were so stressed out because they are just in such a stressful kind of job. And just talking about this, and sort of talking about how, we've got these skewed perceptions, and what are things really like, and what can you do? And here are things that you can do. So many of the reporters were like, oh my gosh, I feel so much better just from talking to you. So, I mean, people are receiving it well. And at the same time, there's also people who I'm hearing say, dialogue, I don't want to connect with people across the divide. That is not the approach that we should be taking. You're talking about managing emotions. Isn't that tone policing? So there's some negativity about trying to talk to people across the divide. And this is one of the reasons I wrote that article for Medium, because when people are reacting in that way, and I asked them about well, who are you thinking that I'm saying we should be talking to? And they're like, well, I don't want to, talk to the white supremacists. Are you telling me I need to have a conversation with those people who invaded the Capitol? And I'm like, if you know any of those people who invaded the Capitol, you should probably call the police. I'm not saying you should necessarily have this conversation with everyone, but one of the things that we know is that most people are not the people who invaded the Capitol. And even most people do not support them. Most Republicans don't support them. Most Trump voters don't support them, don't feel like they represent them. But the media gives us this, sort of skewed idea, because they are representing the most extreme. Because that's just more interesting, news. It's not so interesting to interview people who are like, yeah, I can kind of see things either way. That's not interesting news. So that's the other thing that I've seen, is that our perceptions of people across the divide are keeping us from connecting, and those perceptions are largely incorrect.
Yes, I appreciate your, I think two things: your attention to the process, right? What happens for people psychologically in these pretty challenging and maybe threatening feeling conversations. And also just generally how our brains work, and some of the shortcuts that our brains take, which we're all sort of susceptible to. And so my second question is a little bit more kind of moving us towards that intersection of supervision and training. And so obviously your book outlines, helpful steps and tools to use in engaging in these difficult dialogues. I'm curious what additional considerations you might offer for supervisors and also supervisees who might be taking on these conversations. But also while managing the power dynamics that are pretty inherent in those working relationships. So I'm curious if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'm seeing a couple of folks having that question. And so let me speak to one aspect of what Megan has asked about, we've been taught to avoid political conversations in the workplace. Like, we're not supposed to talk about politics, and we're not supposed to talk about, we're not supposed to sort of advocate for our political positions and candidates and things within educational environments. And so what do we do there? So one of the things to keep in mind is, in terms of what we are or aren't supposed to do in educational environments, we're not supposed to advocate for candidates, and we're not supposed to advocate for political parties. But that doesn't mean that we can't talk about policies. It doesn't mean that we can't talk about people's reactions to different events that happen, especially as they have meaning for the work that we're doing. I always try to create a space where people, I always try to keep in mind, like, when I'm teaching a big class, I'm like, there's people in here who don't agree with me, and my job is to teach them also. Like, it's to teach everybody. And so I don't want to alienate them. And at the same time, that doesn't mean that I have to agree with everything they say, but I need to create an environment where they can feel like I'm going to evaluate them fairly. And so I think that the same thing is true. Like, in a large environment, you don't necessarily know what everybody's views are. In a supervision kind of context, you might have a better sense of where people are, and they might have a better sense of where you are because of the context where those things are happening. So I think it's important that we create an environment where people don't feel like we are going to unfairly evaluate them because of what their political views are. People might, trainees might have certain views, but that might not influence sort of how they're working with their clients. Like, it might not negatively impact it. And some of this is the meanings that we put on things. Like, we think, okay, well, if somebody, if a trainee thinks, oh yeah, it's good to build a wall, between the US and Mexico, then we might think, well, they cannot possibly work with immigrant clients because they obviously, like, are anti-immigrant. I think that's something to find out. Like, what do they think? That thinking that there should be a wall doesn't necessarily tell us, first of all, what their view is on immigration and on immigrants. And it also doesn't tell us how they're going to work with clients around that. So I think sometimes we're using shorthand in terms of what somebody's opinion is about either a candidate or a political figure or a policy, and making assumptions about how that then would play out in a clinical context. And we might not be right about that. So I really think that's an area to explore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not jumping to the end, kind of staying in that understanding, curiosity, openness phase a little longer. Mm-hmm. Great. We did have another question that actually, like, it seems like it's posted in the chat. Looks like it from one of our attendees that I think touches on this topic of when the content is emotionally activating for us. And so this question says, as a woman of color, do you have any rage at the racism violence that we're hearing about? What advice would you give to people like me who gets debilitatingly angry at racism to help bridge my passion with the techniques you've outlined? So I imagine there's, different ways in which this question might apply to folks differently, but certainly that activation piece and, like, what do we do with that, I think is helpful to speak to.
Absolutely. Such a good question. It's such a hard question. And I think, some of it is also thinking, like, I always think, all right, there's different kinds of advice I sometimes give to people who are members of the target group, and then maybe different advice I give to people who want to be allies. So let me talk about allies first, and then let me talk about people who are members of the target group. So there was so much going on, there's been so much going on this past year around Black Lives Matter and around now Asian American hate and, all of these, different kinds of things around immigration. There's so much that's happening that has to do with race. And so if you are a white person who wants to be an ally, I've heard from a lot of white people who are experiencing that rage and feeling like the thing that you need to do about that is to cut off all the people who might be racist. Cut off the people, it's like if you've got somebody in your life who you're perceiving as racist, like the thing you want to do is to not talk to them. And the thing I always just say is, oh God, like, don't do that. Like, if you're not talking to them, who's going to? Like, if you've got some access there that a person of color might not have. And so I think it's one of the responsibilities of allies to work with managing their emotion around this so that they can do that ally work. And you've got to then have the support, you've got to have the people who you can get that support from and who you can vent to and all of that. So it's not saying you've got to like keep a lid on it all the time. It's saying go find the place where you can get the support and vent, and please like find other white people who you can do that with and who can support each other, so that you've got the energy to go try to change the world in the way that's going to make it better for people of color. Like, I always feel like your anger is not necessarily helping me as a person of color. So let's translate that into the supervision and training context, which is, it's again this thing where you're out like a white person's outrage is not necessarily helping people of color. And if you are in the job where it's your job to educate other people as a teacher, as a supervisor, then you've got to figure out what's going to make me an effective educator here. And I think then, deal with the emotions around that elsewhere, the emotions that are getting in the way of being able to be an effective teacher. And sometimes, emotion makes you a more effective teacher or supervisor in different ways, but you've got to sort of sort out where it does and where it doesn't. Okay, so now let's talk about, like, what if you're a person of color and you're being confronted with a racist supervisor, supervisee, client, any of those kinds of situations. So I do think that that's a little bit different in a way. And the first thing I would say is, I don't know, I find as a person of color, I'm a little bit more used to that. Like I kind of know sometimes how to navigate racism because I've had to in my life, and people of color have had to in their lives, and that's not a good thing. But that there are, sometimes some skills that we've developed around that I sometimes find that white allies haven't necessarily developed all of those skills. So I think that that's the first thing, is like, okay, like, I recognize that there are skills, like, it's not fair that we have to use those or have those, but sometimes we do. So I think that's one of the first things is, all right, sometimes we know how to do this, drawing on that, and then getting the support that we need. So if you are a trainee and you're dealing with, with a racist client, hopefully you've got a supervisor who's going to give you space to process that, and who's going to give you support to process that, and to figure out then, how do you go back into that and work with that client, or where is that's not going to work for you, so sometimes, things do harm in those ways, and you say, I'm not going to be able to work with this client. The same way that I see people saying, I feel like I can't have this conversation because this is doing me harm. What I always say is, I think that's fine. Like you're not required to expose yourself to that. And at the same time, I think sometimes it's important not to prematurely cut off those possibilities of going into that. So some of it might have to do with, like, what are you actually hearing from that client? And is that something that you have assumptions about the meanings of that? Like, if you see that your client is, has a certain political party, or is wearing a hat or a shirt that says something that, you're like, oh my gosh, no, I can't work with that kind of person. But do we know who that person really is and what the meanings are behind that for them? That's a really long answer. I don't know if it answered the question, but those are some of my thoughts.
Yes. I heard some pieces in there about, like, evaluating your own capacity, checking in with like existing skills that you have, acknowledging your position in relation to other folks and like the assumptions you might be having with individuals. We have a lot of questions here, so I want to like pop back and see if we can get to as many of these as we can. There was one here, sorry, I'm going to scroll up for just a moment. So this one says, at times it feels like social justice is so aligned with left-leaning politics. It's hard as an instructor to navigate how we can center social justice in courses when there are conservative students present. How do we balance social justice with political ideology? I think you spoke to this a little bit earlier, but I was wondering if you had other thoughts about it.
That's a great question. I mean, I remember when I was teaching that class, and it was like right after the 2016 election, and it was like every day, it was starting in that January, and it was like there was the inauguration and the Muslim ban and the Women's March, and it was just like every single day there was something happening that like we needed to deal with and talk about. And so I remember needing to think about, all right, well, how do we do this? How do we do this in a way that we're really focusing on social justice, but it's not just about politics, and it's not just about like fretting about everything that's happening? Because to me, social justice isn't just about like having an opinion. It's not just about posting something on social media. It's about what are we going to do that's going to make a difference? And so a lot of that, I think, is about having some skills. Like it's about having knowledge and having some perspective on what's going on. And so I think we can, that's the part that, we can bring some understandings of things through a social justice lens. But also the skills are the skills, the skills to be able to work with community, especially marginalized communities, the skills to be able to organize within those communities and collaborate, the skills to be able to communicate with policymakers, the skills to be able to do the kind of research that will inform policy. All of those are skills that, aren't like they're what will help us to achieve social justice, I believe. But those, they are neutral skills in a way. So then it's a matter of like, how do we layer the content on top of that to be able to use those skills in such a way that they're going to change the world in a certain way. I think it's really interesting. There's some good research that's been done on like what are the things that make somebody a social justice advocate. And Arpana Inman has done some of that work, and a number of other counseling psychologists. And so some of that is just having a belief that it is an unjust world. And not everybody has that belief. So that's part of where bringing some of that knowledge that we have and shining a light on some things can help can help people to develop that understanding, I would say, but not everybody's coming in with that understanding to begin with. So it's developing that understanding and then the skills, pairing it with the skills.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I have another question here that sort of brings us back to some of the supervision and training piece. So it says, what advice do you have about ways to encourage trainees who may have been taught to avoid political conversations in the workplace? Like, this is a no-no, you got to keep that out of it, to address ways that their countertransference might be working with clients between supervisor. Oh, wait, I might have misread this here. Let's focus on the first part. So what are some like pieces of advice you might give for supervisors who are wanting to encourage trainees to move towards these conversations and these dialogues, and do a little bit of re-socializing from some of what our earlier training might have told us like we shouldn't be talking about?
Sure. I think really focusing on meaning. I'm a big like existential person. So I'm like, I love talking about meaning. So, and that comes up in lots of different theoretical orientations. So, if somebody is talking about something that we think of as political, I think like what meaning does that have for them? If it's a reaction that they have to Republicans or to Democrats or to voting rights or various things, the the thing about not talking about politics in an educational environment is, I think we really need to understand this. We don't always get taught this very well. If we're not supposed to talk about politics because we're not supposed to have conflict, that's one thing. But I think that a lot of it has to do with, we don't want to put, if we're teaching in an educational institution, then we should not be using the resources of that. I mean, if it's a nonprofit, we should not be using the resources of that institution to advocate for candidates or political parties. That is where the line is. Everything else is fair game. So it's not that we're not supposed to talk about policies and values and issues. Like, yeah, if like, we should be able to do that within an educational environment, and that includes a supervision and training kind of environment. Because those things, have an effect on our clients, on our supervisees, and they also have meaning beyond policies, that they have meaning for people in terms of their values, in terms of their identities, all of those things. And so I just want to say, like, it's okay to talk about politics in those ways. Just don't, but make a very clear line for yourself in terms of not going to talk about, like, advocating for candidates. I mean, honestly, once somebody's on office, you can say anything you want about them, but it's about not advocating for candidates or political parties.
Yes, like, it's a universal skill for us to be able to engage in dialogues, right? To be able to engage in the process. But perhaps the like pushing content or pushing a viewpoint, when it's related to a particular candidate, this is more where the line is. I'm really appreciating your attention to the process, right? Because it's can feel like such a fraught process for people, and there is a skills element to it, right? If we don't have the skills, how are we supposed to do it? And if we're not encouraged to engage in the dialogues and they feel threatening, then people are not developing the skills. So I can see a little bit of how people get stuck in a little bit of a rut around it, right? And so one of the questions here actually poses a specific scenario. I thought it might be helpful for us to get a little more specific around, like, what particular like tools or steps, things you might engage in. So this question says, I have a supervisee who said she simply cannot accept the idea of a child being transgender. She refers any cases, so acknowledges her stance. What do you recommend as the next step?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. Sally, I'm so glad you asked that question. Because this is a challenge for people, because people are coming in with values, and some of those values might not be supportive of clients' mental health. And so what do we do about that? And I mean, so let's talk about this in this specific case, because I remember, I don't know, it was probably a decade ago or so, we had a joint conversation between folks in Division 44 and Division 39, which are LGBT psychology and religion. And it was such a good conversation, because I loved hearing from trainees. There were some folks who had gone to religious undergraduate institutions, like conservative religious undergraduate institutions, and just had not been exposed to certain ideas, to certain communities of people, particularly sexual and gender minorities. And so when they started their graduate programs, they were, they were in this place where they weren't, like, what they knew about these populations was largely shaped by conservative religious values. And the thing that I realized about, like, work, I have to say, I think it's so interesting working with students who come from those kinds of backgrounds, or it doesn't even have to be that extreme, because I mean, frankly, our whole society, you're going to hear a lot of negative stuff about transgender people, about, about people of color, about, like, all kinds of folks. And so how do we work with people if they're not coming into our programs with a set of values that we feel like is most supportive of our clients' mental health? And I think we have to know that not everybody's going to come in with like all of that. And even if they're coming in with basically that, they might not have all of it. So we need to know how to work with people who aren't already on board with things. And so I guess that's one of the things that I would ask. It's like, okay, well, how do we do that then generally? And then how do we apply that to some more specific situations? So I think doing some more exploration around that, somebody says, well, I can't work with a transgender client. I can't accept that the idea that anyone is transgender. Then I think exploring that some more and wanting to know about it more, and then say, okay, well, what I'd encourage you to do, like what's been your exposure to these ideas? What's been your exposure to people who are transgender? Okay, well, you haven't had much. Let me give you an opportunity to have some exposure to those things, and then let's talk about it some more. And so creating an environment where we recognize this is a supervision and training. These are learning environments. If it's a learning environment, we have to assume that people don't already know everything or don't already have a certain stance coming in. We want to give them the opportunity to grow in their knowledge and understanding as much as possible. So again, what do we need to do as supervisors, as instructors, in order to help people get to that point? Like, we have to, first of all, I think, accept the fact that they're not coming in with with all that knowledge and exposure. And we need to, be able to maintain that connection with them. We need for them to be able to tell us that. So first of all, like, that's great if your supervisee felt like they could tell you that, because you want them to tell you if they're having that challenge there. And okay, I'm seeing clarification. This is a private supervisee who's been in the field for a decade. So it's not an early person. It's not someone who's in this program. It's someone who's like, okay, I've been in this field for a decade and I still just can't imagine it. Okay, so what are the next steps? So it sounds like this person's already acknowledging, like, I probably shouldn't be working with these clients. So I'm going to refer these cases. So first of all, that's probably good, that she's doing that. I mean, obviously you also want that person to try to grow where they can. All right, like, things I'm just going to say in terms of, and I'll say LGBT issues broadly, but honestly, in terms of transgender issues more specifically, things are changing rapidly in our society, and it's hard for some people to sort of make those shifts that quickly. So I would say probably the same things I just said, like, what's your exposure been? What are the meanings for you? Okay, why don't you take a look at some of these things and let's come back and talk about it, and what's going on for you around this. And I would say explore it to the extent that you can. And at some point you might realize, yeah, this person is at their potential in terms of being able to embrace this. But I think we want to always do it in a way that is inviting somebody in to learning more and trying to help them to reach their potential in terms of their understanding of populations that that they haven't been exposed to or don't have views that are going to support the mental health of their clients.
Mm-hmm. Yes, some level of like meeting folks with acceptance and where they are, and also inviting them to expand and grow, which is maybe part of their responsibility if they're a trainee or if they're in a learning role. Along those lines, I wanted to also bring up this question, again, a little bit more application based of, you have some exercises and great examples in your book that I really appreciated, and was wondering if there were ideas you had about how to translate some of these tools and exercises more specifically for like group supervision or a practicum seminar, if there's ways that you envision this looking for training mental health providers specifically.
That's a great question. People have been telling me that the chapter on listening, they're like, this is just the material that we should be using when we're training people how to listen. And probably that's because I've been teaching listening skills for a long time. And so I think we can sort of translate it back into our field. I sort of translated it out of our field for a general audience, particularly around dialogue across political disagreement. But it's certainly something that then we can translate it back and say, okay, like let's use this in terms of thinking about listening. I hadn't thought about specifically about using some of these exercises for trainees, but some of them, like the perspective taking one, I feel like could be useful if people are really having trouble kind of getting where their client's coming from. And especially if their client is sort of has a political stance that the clinician has a real reaction to, or has some sort of pre-existing beliefs about or conflict with, or something like that. I think anything that we can do to try to understand things from a client's perspective can be useful. So the perspective taking exercises in there might be helpful in that way. And then, like I said, the listening piece, and then the chapter on managing emotions is really also completely taken from just what we do in our field. But it can be useful, I think, some for training trainees, but also for like clinicians to provide to their clients, like some things that you might do, and some ways that you might approach things, and some things you might practice to do these things. I think we already do some of those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Yes, great, thank you. Let's see, we had another question. So we've kind of gone like pretty specific with some examples, and then there's also a more general question here about suggestions for translating these tips to interacting with larger systems rather than individuals. So like expanding it out.
Oh, such a good question, because I feel like we're having so much trouble these days when so much of our interaction with other people is on social media, and it's in this sort of public facing way. And then like, how do we do a different thing maybe when we're having dialogue? So let me talk about that, and then I'll talk about sort of shifting to outward. How do we do this within systems? Because I hear people saying, with social media, like, I'm trying to, I've tried to have these conversations, or I've tried to engage with people, and they're really just talking about like commenting on people's Facebook posts. And I'm like, okay, that's not the same thing. There's a different kind of thing that happens when we're doing public facing stuff versus when we can have a one-on-one conversation. Because sometimes the public facing stuff, and this might relate to what we do within larger systems, the public facing stuff, we're trying to do a lot of different things at once. So we might be, okay, well, I want to have conversations with people who disagree with me, but I also want to demonstrate my solidarity with people who are marginalized and people who are being targeted by this. And it can be really hard to do both of those messages simultaneously. So the first thing that I'll say is sometimes there's different things that we want to do in different settings. And when we're in a more public venue, and that includes social media, we might be trying to put things out there to say like, I've got your back, I'm in solidarity with you, like all of those things. And those aren't necessarily the same ways to message things for people who we're having a one-on-one conversation with. Because when we're doing these kind of solidarity things, often we're using a kind of shorthand to communicate, with slogans and things like that. And that's not really what's going to help to accomplish those goals one-on-one. So then what happens if we want to try to approach systems of things? I got to be on a panel recently for this APA advocacy summit where, people were, psychologists are about to go to the Hill, and go like we go anywhere these days, like Zoom to the Hill and talk to legislators about various things. And so we were talking about like, how do you do that? How do you approach them? And some people are like, how am I going to go and talk to these legislators who wanted to decertify the election results? Like, I can't go talk to them. And my feeling is, okay, like, you're not actually going to talk to them about the election results. You're going to talk to them about advocating for resources for the field of psychology, for things that are going to help your clients, things that are going to, and so I think sometimes we have to, again, go back to, what are your goals? Like, what are you trying to accomplish here? And what are you going to be able to accomplish in different sorts of settings? So it turns out that if you're talking to policymakers, you want to use exactly the same skills we talked about. I mean, some of the listening skills, but even more so when you're talking, share stories, and not just stats and slogans, and talk about what's meaningful and important to you. But also, as you're viewing who they are, I think sometimes we think about policymakers in these very kind of like evil ways, and sure that there are folks who, don't have, are not always in integrity. But my experience of policymakers is that for the most part, they're trying to they're trying to do what they think is going to be most helpful to the public. And they just might have a really different view on that than you do. So if you are trying to deal with like larger systems in terms of policymakers, I think going in with an assumption that they are trying to do their best, and uh, and share stories, listen to them, try to understand where are they coming from, what is it that's important to them, and then trying to frame whatever you're advocating for from that perspective. So I don't know if there was, Penelope, if you've got a different kind of larger system that you're thinking about, then let me know if there's something else I can speak to around that.
All right, so I think I'm looking through our chat here at our different questions. I think we've made our way through most of our questions. I also did want to leave a little bit of time just for you, Tania, Dr. Israel, to share. I don't know if there's other like comments, takeaways, things that you thought would be just really great for people to have highlighted for folks that we didn't get to specifically in any of our questions before we wrap up in the next couple of minutes.
Thanks for that. The one thing that's coming to mind is to take care of yourself. And it can be really, like, I just want to acknowledge that it can be really stressful being exposed to someone who's got ideas that are really different from yours. And especially if those ideas feel like they are invalidating you as a person and, your identities and experiences and values. And so, taking care of sometimes we think that taking care of ourselves is like cutting ourselves off from those experiences that feel difficult for us. And sometimes that is what we need to do. We need to like not, expose ourselves as much to things. But when we're in a professional setting, sometimes, it's necessary. Like we're not always going to be able to say, well, I don't want to work with this client because, they're in this political party or whatever it is. So recognize where that's hard for you, and make sure that you're getting the support that you need. And you might be getting that hopefully from your supervisor or from other people in your professional realm or other people who are in your communities in various ways. But I want to acknowledge that it can be challenging, and there are things that we can, not only that we can gain from that, but also just being able to open up that dialogue and to open up our hearts to people who might have a different kind of perspective and different kind of experiences. I think that's going to benefit us on professional levels as well as personal levels, just to complexify things beyond what we see in the media and what our kind of limited perceptions might be of other folks.
Yes, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to share all this lovely information and your perspectives, and being so like normalizing of how challenging and how difficult it is to engage in these dialogues, but also offering a way forward. I know for myself, as someone who's often felt overwhelmed and activated by some of these conversations, it feels like a bit of a relief to feel like there's some scaffolding, there's some framework I can try to implement and utilize to help me out a little bit. So thank you so much for your time. For folks who are still with us in the webinar, Dr. Israel's information is posted in the chat there. You can follow her on social media. Her book is available. Also, the article you mentioned on Medium is, the link is posted there. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate your attendance and your thoughtful questions, and look forward to having you join us for future webinars through the section.
Thank you so much. This was delightful. Thank you all for being here and for your great questions, and just for the work that you're doing. So, and take care of yourselves out there.
Thank you.